You're sitting at the kitchen table, pen in hand, the homeowner's insurance renewal form laid out in front of you. One simple question: list all current assets and debts. You start writing. Car, the SUV you drive. The next line asking whether it's leased or paid off. You pause. It's leased, meaning on paper, it isn't your asset at all, just a monthly expense, wearing the shape of ownership. You keep writing. The house, estimated value against the remaining loan balance, the gap smaller than you thought. Credit card, an unpaid balance carried for a few months now, a number you keep telling yourself you'll pay off next month. At the final line, you add everything up and sit staring at the result for a long while. It isn't negative, but it's small enough that you read back through the whole form, checking if you missed something. You didn't write anything wrong. You'd simply never seen all these numbers standing next to each other on the same sheet of paper at the same time. You set the pen down, pick the form back up and read it from the start, as if reading it again would change the number. It doesn't. You look around the kitchen, the new refrigerator, the custom-made wooden dining set. Everything in sight is proof your family is doing well. But none of it appears on this form as an asset of any real net worth. They're just possessions, losing value the moment they were bought, exactly like the SUV parked out in the garage. 6 months before that evening, you got a substantial raise after your year-end review. The feeling at the time was genuinely great, earned after everything you'd put in. The following week, you stopped by a dealership just to look, initially just to look. But the new SUV rode incredibly smooth, and with the raise you'd just received, the monthly lease payment sounded completely reasonable. You signed the lease that same afternoon, trading in the 7-year-old sedan that still ran fine, the one you used to be proud of because you'd paid it off long ago. A month later, you were having lunch with a coworker at the same level as you, who mentioned putting a deposit down on a family trip to a luxury resort, business-class flights for the whole family. You went home that night, opened your phone, and booked a similar trip for your own family, even though you'd never once considered flying business class before. No one pressured you into it. It's just that the number in your head for what counted as a trip worthy of us had shifted, and you never noticed exactly when. A few weeks later, at your child's public school parent meeting, you overheard 2 other parents discussing moving their kids to a nearby private school, tuition far from small, but in their view, a worthwhile investment in their children's future. You went home, talked it over with your spouse, and within a week, both of you decided to do the same. Private school tuition, once started, isn't the kind of expense you can just stop mid-year. It becomes a new fixed cost, sitting quietly alongside the car lease and the mortgage, steadily withdrawn every month before you ever get the chance to think about saving. That same month, you attended a coworker's kid's birthday party, held at their house, noticeably bigger than yours, with a backyard that had just been renovated. The host mentioned, quite casually, the second mortgage they'd just taken out to fund that renovation. On the drive home, you and your spouse started discussing whether to renovate your own living room, even though before that party, the idea had never once crossed either of your minds. One evening scrolling social media, you saw a photo from an old classmate, posted from a mountain vacation home, a short caption about their new second house. You have no idea how much debt that person is actually carrying to maintain 2 homes at once. You only saw the picture, and a quiet feeling rose up, that maybe you were falling behind your peers, even though your income, on paper, was hardly low. There was a moment, about 3 months before that night filling out the insurance form, when you stumbled across a widely shared rule of thumb. Take your age, multiply it by your annual pre-tax income, then divide by 10, and the result is considered a reference net worth benchmark for someone at that age and income level. Curious, you tried calculating it for yourself, then quickly closed the calculator, not wanting to look at that number again. The gap between that benchmark and your actual account balance was bigger than you wanted to admit. Every few months, the credit card statement arrives with an unpaid balance, not huge, just the leftover from one slightly indulgent month, and you always tell yourself you'll pay it off next month. But next month always brings another expense, a car repair, a birthday gift, and that balance, instead of disappearing, just shifts from one shape to another, always present, never actually reaching zero. One evening your child asked, quite innocently, whether your family was rich. You laughed, said things were doing pretty well, then brought up the new SUV, the recent summer trip, as an indirect answer. Your child nodded, seemed satisfied with that. But after they went to bed, you sat alone and realized the answer you'd just given rested entirely on things being leased, borrowed, financed, not on any specific net worth figure you actually knew for certain. The night you sat writing that insurance form, after adding everything up, you sat quietly for a long while. You thought about the leased SUV, your child's private school, the business class flights from this past summer. All of it was real. All of it brought genuine joy at the moment you chose it. But when required to list them as assets, most of it never appeared in the left-hand column at all. It only appeared in the right-hand column, as ongoing monthly expenses that were still running. One thing has to be acknowledged, sitting at that kitchen table that night, not all of this gap comes down to a lack of discipline on your part. Private school tuition has risen faster than your salary for years. Income tax takes a substantial cut before you ever see the number on your paycheck. Home prices in the area you live, where jobs pay as well as yours do, are also considerably higher than elsewhere. This isn't a problem with only one variable, personal willpower. But even discounting for all of those factors, one truth still holds. Among the choices actually within your control, most of your added income over the past few years flowed straight into new expenses, instead of into the asset column. You try picturing a different version of the past few years, one where you kept the old sedan a while longer, kept your child in public school one more year before deciding, booked economy seats for the summer trip. None of those versions sound harsh or lacking in any way. They're simply versions where the difference, instead of turning into experiences, would have turned into numbers in the left-hand column of that insurance form, the numbers you're missing tonight. A few days later, you had a short call with an acquaintance who works in finance, just to ask about restructuring a loan. After hearing you describe your situation briefly, he said something quite gently, without judgment. I meet a lot of people with incomes like yours, whose net worth looks no different from someone earning half as much. Not because they're worse with money, just because no one ever asked them to sit down and add everything up at once, the way you did last night. You ask back, partly hoping for reassurance, whether your situation was really that bad, or just normal for this stage of life, with young kids, with a career still climbing. He didn't deny it. He said yes, this stage is usually more expensive, and no one expects you to have massive net worth at this age. But he also asked back, quite gently, of the new expenses that have appeared in recent years, how many were conscious choices, and how many simply happened, because they seemed reasonable at that exact moment. You couldn't answer that question right away. You just thanked him, hung up, and sat quietly in the kitchen for a while. What's lost here isn't any specific amount of money. It's the certainty you used to have that a high income meant financial safety. The car, the school, the flight, all of them were reasonable choices at the moment you made them. But when forced to write them down on a form demanding a true list of assets, most of them vanished from the left-hand column, exposing a gap that high income, on its own, has never once been capable of filling. The next evening, you opened the filled-out insurance form again, not to change any number, just to look at it once more. You grabbed another sheet of paper, wrote down 3 items from your monthly spending you thought you could redirect, not cut entirely, just shift a small portion from the right-hand column to the left, starting next month. You didn't cancel anything that night, you just left that sheet on the table, where you'd see it in the morning. You looked at those 3 lines one last time before turning off the kitchen light. None of them were the SUV or your child's school. You weren't ready to touch those big items yet, and maybe there was no need to touch them right away either. The 3 lines you'd written were just smaller things, habits that had quietly formed, and that no one in the house really questioned the value of anymore. A very modest start, but for the first time in a long while, it was a deliberate one, instead of just another reflex. Nothing changed right away. The SUV still sat in the garage, the lease still stood as written. But something very small was different. You no longer looked at your possessions as proof of success. You saw them as what they actually were, a list of choices, some that had built lasting value, some that were only renting the feeling of success, while quietly withdrawing money every month. This story isn't really about any particular car or school. It's about the gap between looking successful and actually having a solid financial foundation, a gap that income, on its own, can never fill by itself, and about how most of what you own might be telling a very different story than the one you always assumed it was telling. The coworker with the business class flight isn't actually wealthier than you. The old classmate with the second house on social media isn't necessarily more secure than you either. It's entirely possible that if they sat down and filled out a form like yours that night, their number would look no different at all. So if you had to list everything you own right now, do you think that list would prove how hard you've worked, or would it only prove how much you've spent?